Today we're going to be talking about the topic of postmodernism. So postmodernism is in many ways still an ongoing style. Some people hate it, some people love it. It is quite polarizing. So today we're going to get to the origins, where did this come from, the philosophy, the theory behind it, why is it called postmodern, and then what can we learn from it generally. But to begin learning about postmodernism, it's first important to turn to what happened right before that. So the reason we have postmodernism is in large part because of Corb. So Corbu proposes his unidad de habitación. We saw this in the City of 3 Million concept, where he said we would have these zigzag patterns of buildings where you could house a number of people. Remember, these are the ones that have the interlocking units with cross ventilation, and then the elevator only stops every 3 floors. It was a revolutionary way of living, and the reason why it was commissioned was because after the war in France, we had a lot of displaced people. We needed to house people quickly, we needed to give them amenities, we needed to do it in a way that was cheap. And so places like this were really the solution to that. And remember, that these were actually very luxurious places to live in even today, right? They have beautiful, beautiful interiors, very expensive to live there. They do have shopping arcades, they have pools, daycare, dry cleaning services. They even had childcare there for you. So it was an all-in-one type of complex and really made it attractive to live there. And so people from all around the world, architects, other countries are beginning to see this and they are copying it, not just because of the, lifestyle it's selling, but mostly because it's cheap. You can, house a large amount of people in a smaller plot of land, and it's believed that it's going to give them an elevated lifestyle. Now, keep in the back of your minds that the reason it was an elevated lifestyle was because he had access to greenery, the free facade, the free plan, these beautiful L shapes, and then, of course, all of the amenities he provides the residences. So, this is Pruitt-Igoe. It is a very famous or infamous housing development in St. Louis, Missouri. It did get constructed in the 50s, 60s. So Pruitt is this bottom portion over here. This was still during the time of segregation. So Pruitt is where African American residents live, and then Igoe on the top part over here is where white residents could have lived in. But they're largely the same type of building, right? They're these large slabs with lots of units slid into there. Now, when you begin to look at the interior images, I think you can begin to see that this is not really exactly what Corb had in mind, right? Corbu said that we needed to have these be these slide modules because he wanted outdoor spaces on both ends. And if you look at these images, that's very clearly not attached to a balcony or an outdoor space. It might be an operable window that you can open, but there's really no private green space there. So that's already one of the flaws that happened in Pruitt-Igoe. Then you can see we do have the addition of mechanical systems, which largely kind of did a disservice to architecture in many ways, because now architects didn't have to worry about actually designing the building to respond to the elements, right? You can just use the AC to turn the temperature down, even if your whole building is made out of glass. So that was one of the things that happened that also made projects like this quite unsuccessful. The other thing about Pruitt-Igoe is that in trying to copy Unité d'Habitation, remember, in Unité, we had the elevator stop every 3 levels. Why? Because of those interlocking, units. It's the floor plan that dictated that's why it should be that way. But if you're a resident of Unité and you had, grocery shopping, if you were just going up to your level, you would have an elevator that would take you straight to the entrance of your unit door. Now, Pruitt-Igoe tried to copy that concept, but the issue is they didn't have the same unit layouts. They instead had traditional, one-story apartment units with a single door, but they kept the elevator every other floor concept, or every 2 floors in this case. And that became one of its major issues that led to its downfall, because of the fact that if you live, for example, in this unit, you either have to come all the way up to this stop and then take a flight of stairs down, or you have to take this elevator and take 2 flights of stairs up into your unit. So now the stairwells become this kind of inevitable place that you have to be in. And eventually it becomes very crime ridden in those stairwells. So it's not very user friendly, it is not accessible, it is not really selling that lifestyle that Unité was providing for its residents. It was also very poorly constructed. So again, the purpose of building these for most cities around the world at the time was not so much to, give the citizens a great lifestyle. It was just because it was cheap and it was high density. So you could have a large amount of people in a smaller site. And because of that, you tended to go very cheap on materials, on construction, even on the architecture itself. So whereas in Unite, going back to the section very quickly, the hallways are in the center, and then you enter from either side, and then you go up to your loft to have that cross ventilation. In Pruitt-Igoe, the circulation, if you notice, is on the end of the building, right? So then you have this hallway on the edge of the building, and from there you can enter the units in on the back side. And so when you're coming up on the elevator, as you walk down your unit, you have these exterior hallways that have these ribbon windows that you can see articulated on the facade right here. But because they're not conditioned and the interior of the actual apartments are conditioned, you do get a lot of condensation. The cheap construction does lead to a lot of pipes bursting. So this is what it looks like every winter. So Pruitt-Igoe is really only successful for around 5 years, right? We have a lot of the wealthier residents, middle class residents. People want to live here. And especially for the African American population, this is an opportunity to live in a higher rise, nice apartment building. And after 5 years, it just looks like this. So we do have the phenomenon of white flight. Most of the residents from Igoe, the white portion, do leave. And eventually the middle class African American residents also leave. So this becomes quite abandoned. It does become pretty much a crime-ridden building where you have a lot of drug sales going on, a lot of crime rates, a lot of mugging in the staircases. So no one wants to live here. It is very, very far from Corbu's vision of what an ideal, residential place should be. And then if you notice, this is those windows that would freeze over. So basically you get off on your elevator here. You have to walk down a super long hallway that's freezing cold, usually flooded with water. There's going to be people hidden in all these, niches in the architecture to get into your apartment. So it's really not a pleasant experience at all, and it becomes very unsafe. And so this project, like many of the projects around the world, does become a kind of that image for modern architecture, right? And I told you, Corbu, like many other modernists, have this super detailed vision of what the future of the cities could look like, and we have the architect's hand constantly, interjecting and telling us how to live our lives. That's the vision. But as you saw in City for 3 Million, although maybe not all the ideas were great, his vision of what people could, how people's lives could be inside of these units was actually quite nice. He was giving them a lot of, amenities and things in close proximity versus Pruitt-Igoe, which pretty much stripped it of all of that and just gave you a bunch of living units with no amenities. And when you don't have amenities, your citizens aren't really as proactive. They're not going to be willing to take care of the building as much. And then you pair that with cheap construction, you do have a lot of issues. So eventually, Pruitt-Igoe is demolished. It does come down less than 30 years after it's constructed, which is incredibly unsustainable to be building this amount and then getting rid of it. It would have been a lot cheaper and a lot more efficient to just build it well the first time around, and it would still be standing today. So, because of this, we do have this kind of narrative begin to spread. People believe that not only modernism, but the public housing, because this was a public housing attempt, are things that just don't work. And even today, the United States does have a kind of bias towards the idea of public housing because of projects like these. But again, it's not that they're inherently unsuccessful, it's just that they don't really cater anything to its citizens. So in the end, they're very unsuccessful projects and they're cheap construction. So you can't really expect an elevated lifestyle when the architecture is not elevated at all. And this didn't just happen in the United States, it happened all over the world. So this is a typical image from Eastern Europe. If you've ever seen those images, then you know what I'm talking about. It's just rows and rows and rows of concrete buildings. And again, it was meant to house a number of people in a single unit. But when you don't give the amenities, then you're just kind of stuck in this concrete jungle with a bunch of other people that need to go to the center of the city to obtain their goods. So these become quite desolate when people are at work. It really doesn't cater to the ideal urbanist lifestyle. And pair that with poor construction techniques, they're very quickly deteriorating. They have to be bulldozed and replaced quite often, which once again is unsustainable. So people begin to become disenamored with the idea of modernist architecture. But I want us to remember modernist architecture is, celebrating industrialized materials, meaning that we're using them in ingenious ways that are going to improve the lives of people because we're using things that are cheaper to give them a better lifestyle, which this is not. Number two, form follows function, which most of these are not. They're just kind of putting residences next to each other, and they're not really thinking about how people are going to experience those spaces, what kind of things you have to provide for them to take care of those residences. And lastly, and most importantly, the idea that we have this social agenda, reform, that is completely absent from most of these projects. So if you go to any major American city and you look at their kind of lower end housing, a lot of it's going to look like this. And it's going to use the name of modernism. But when you look at that true definition of what modernism should be, you'll notice it's really devoid of pretty much most of the characteristics, except for the fact that it's made out of concrete. So we're going to be looking at a couple of quotes that emerge and are a response to all of this kind of bad modernism that's happening. And this is going to directly lead to that movement that we call postmodernism. So let's start with this one. So this quote says, although modern architecture could have developed in a positive direction, it degenerated into a mere style, and one has to ask what has drained away from the social content and substituted another. So notice that they're calling modernism a style. And remember, I told you, modernism is not flat roofs. It is not white paint. It is not using corner windows. It is not, a formative definition. It is an abstracted definition. And in this critique, what they're saying is that modernism, or the modern movement at this point in time in the 70s, has become devoid of everything that it should have been, what the classic original modernists intended for it to be. Now people are just borrowing the look and saying, oh, it's modernist, but they're not really paying attention to what modernism truly is. They then go on to say, our modern, unpleasant cities with their pollution and stress are a kind of illness that reflects not only global environmental sickness, but also a wider crisis in the human condition. So they are blaming modernism and what modernism has done to the cities, these ugly concrete blocks, for the stressful situation that most people are living in. The 1970s did have widespread economic depression as well, which is important to note. And we also have to think about the fact that the 1960s was the era of the counterculture. So people are beginning to rebel against what has become the social norm, and they're beginning to think about people who are traditionally considered minorities, who are traditionally, part of the working class, the lower class, that, this architecture has largely ignored. We then have this other quote from the famous urbanist Jane Jacobs, who states, low-income projects have become worse centers of delinquency, vandalism, and general social hopelessness than the slums that they were supposed to replace. This is not the rebuilding of cities, it is the sacking of cities. And Pruitt-Igoe, the project we just looked at, is a great example of this, right? It was supposed to be this new, bougie lifestyle, and in the end, it did become a center of vandalism, social hopelessness, and what was supposed to be, the rebuilding of the modern city after the world wars, and giving all these families that are coming back from war a new place to live in, became the sacking of the city. They mostly became desolate. They were abandoned altogether. Here's another quote. The indiscriminate worship of technology and the machine, with the naive belief that technology could provide an architect with any material shape or climate he wanted, was one of the major reasons which led to the failure of modern architecture. And notice that in this critique, they are directly talking about technology and the machine. Modernists highly valued the time that a machine could save when it was crafting the pieces. Remember, in the Bauhaus, you created your prototype, you sent it to the machine, and the machine would create it so that it was more accessible because it was cheaper. Now anyone could purchase it. But here it's saying that modernists became too dependent on this pumping out of industrial pieces that were prefabricated, that they stopped caring about the actual meaning of the architecture itself, and they were just creating buildings to create them. And again, that is also a result of the value engineering efforts after the war. In addition, other reasons, such as the failure to understand the historical continuity and the importance of organic growth, also contributed to the disaster. So when it's talking about historical continuity, remember, modernists are trying to be this clean-cut breaking away from the past, not really bringing anything from there. So they're critiquing here the fact that they're not really learning from what the 19th century had. They are completely abandoning it, and they also ignore organic growth. So if we think about Corbu's City for 3 Million, if we think about who else? Tony Garnier's Industrial City, Broadacre, all of these are proposing, let's start from scratch. Let's have a completely clean slate and let's just plaster this plan on, and that's the way we should live. And in the 60s and 70s, people are beginning to realize that the built world as is a product of what people, of what they want, of their culture, of their economy, and that's not a bad thing. And by modernists proposing all these designs that are, starting from a clean slate, they're largely ignoring the history, the culture, everything that comes with the identity of a group of people. Last part of this, the growth of the big private and public corporations since the Second World War, with their desire for expansion, profits, and power, led to the draining of the social content from modern architecture. That last part is key, the social content of modern architecture. So part 3 of our definition, the social reform agenda. So all these corporations coming about, the desire for just money, expansion, profits, power, pretty much destroyed that third point of the definition. So it just led to the formative definition, which is white color, flat roofs, white cubes, and let's just call it modernism. But let's, not worry about what the architecture is actually doing for the resident. And so we have this whole new generation of architects that are inspired by all of these things, that the tension that is, growing in these urbanist centers. And we have Robert Venturi come out of there, who famously writes Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which is your reading for this week. And in it, he's critiquing what modernism has become. So although he likes the idea of the original modernists, he knows that by now people are just kind of plastering the name of modernism on their architecture, but it's a very cheap imitation of it. So we're going to read a couple of his quotes. They're quite long, but I'm going to break them down for you so we can understand where his architecture will later come from. He says, I am for the richness of meaning rather than the clarity of meaning, for the implicit function as well as the explicit function. I prefer both and to either or, black and white, and sometimes gray to black or white. A valid architecture evokes many levels of meaning and combinations of focus. Its space and its elements become readable and workable in several ways at once. So, as the name of the book suggests, complexities and contradictions. He's saying architecture, or the meaning of architecture, doesn't just have to be black or white, one or the other. It can be both at the same time, a little bit of both, a little bit of this one, none at the same time. We don't have to put ourselves in a box, which is what he believes that modernists have done. He then goes on to say, but an architecture of complexity and contradiction has a special obligation towards the whole. Its truth must be in its totality or its implications of totality. It must embody the difficult unity of inclusion rather than the easy unity of exclusion. More is not less. So what is he saying here? That last part where he says the unity of inclusion rather than the easy unity of exclusion. It was largely believed at this time that the reason that modernism was so appealing and successful and it had this kind of high culture to it was because they chose to focus on one issue and then they ignored all the other issues. And so when you just kind of have tunnel vision and look at that one issue and how they resolve it, yes, it looks great. But when you think about all the other factors that they largely ignored, it's not so great. So for instance, if we think about Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion, where he had the glass wall and then he separates the function of privacy from the thermal envelope, yes, you have outdoor spaces, and yes, they're quite beautiful. But if we think about the feeling of privacy, that's one thing that's sacrificed. If you think about the idea of thermal comfort, of how much heat's going to come into the glass, that's another thing that you don't really think about. So he's saying here that the unity of inclusion is better, including all of these problems and solving them in your building, even if it makes it look incoherent, even if it doesn't look like this pristine clean box. That's ultimately better than just ignoring everything and then saying, oh, it's a minimalist design, which is why he says more, meaning more architecture, more ornaments, more just everything, is not less. And he finishes by saying, where simplicity cannot work, simpleness results. Blatant simplification means bland architecture. Less is a bore. So right here he's saying, when you try to make a building that is inherently going to be complex, it needs to do many things at once. It needs to solve a number of problems at once. It needs to cater to different people at once. When simplicity just cannot work for that program and you try to make it happen, it ends up being simple. And when you make it blatantly simple, the architecture just becomes bland and it does not respond to the user in the way that it should. And so he calls less a bore, which famously is a response to Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe and the early modernists, their kind of tagline is less is more, right? Simplifying, distilling a piece of architecture to the least amount of elements, the simplest elements that you can possibly imagine, that ultimately is more. And Robert Ventori, 40 years later, 50 years later, is coming in and saying, actually, no, less is just a bore. It's just boring. It doesn't actually do anything. I think both of these can be true at the same time. There are some great modernist pieces that we've looked at where less is more. It fulfills all the functions. It has a really great lifestyle. But I also agree with Robert Ventori when you think about the type of modernism that was being done in his, day and age. Less was a bore. It was what you'd been seeing for 50 years at that point. It wasn't innovative. It wasn't special. It was not avant-garde anymore. It was the norm. And when you pair that with the fact that it was just a bad living condition, less is not only a bore, it's actually a detriment to society. So this is what postmodernism ultimately becomes. This is one of his earlier projects. It's been credited as the first postmodern building to ever be constructed. Whether that's true or not kind of depends on who you talk to, what historian you read, but we're going to go with that. It's the first postmodern building. Now, if you notice, it's kind of a bluish color. Originally, it was more of a lime green. And the reason Robert Ventori made it lime green is because modernists believed that your architecture should always pop from its surroundings, and especially from nature. So if we think about Corb's Villa Savoie or anything by Corb, it's usually white, right? It's white cube, it's a white concrete, and it's a very stark difference from its environment. And Robert Ventori wanted to challenge that. Many times postmodernists are just doing things to be inflammatory. They're doing things to like the counterculture just to kind of go against the current. And so he paints the house green so that it doesn't really pop that much from its environment. Now, when we look at the form itself, it looks like a house. And if we think back to one of the first lectures, I believe it was the second lecture we had in this course, I showed you a picture of a kindergartner's house. And I asked you what makes it a house, and most of you answered the chimney, the pitched roof, the window, the little flowers. And those are the things that Robert Ventori is deliberately emphasizing in this facade. So let's analyze it very quickly. We have our chimney, which if you notice is really only this wide, but he's emphasizing it by giving it this massive block. It's similar to what Frank Lloyd Wright does, where he emphasizes the hearth of the home, but whereas Frank Lloyd Wright's is actually that thick because it's a very big fireplace, Robert Ventori is showing us, actually no, this is a small, regular sized fireplace. It's a small fireplace for a small home, but I am deliberately making it this thick to really put emphasis on the fact that it is a fireplace. He's exaggerating that feature. That's one of the characteristics of postmodernism, is that they tend to grab symbols of buildings and exaggerate them, so it's really in your face. Over here, he has his pitched roof. Houses traditionally have gables, and in this case, he's being provocative where he kind of separates it, but then he kind of joins it back together with this pediment over here. So he's doing a callback to the temple. He's doing a callback to Renaissance palazzos where they had those horizontal divisions. He's doing a callback to more vernacular East Coast architecture, the use of the chimney, and yet it's not historical, and that's the key to postmodernism. They reference a lot of things. They put it right in your face so you can tell very obviously this is a house. But then if you really look at it and you try to pinpoint certain, elements where they come from, the idea, it's very hard to do. If we look at the back side of it, you can see this is the actual chimney right here. So very, very thin profile. And then this right here, this triangle is that mass that he builds up. So when you look at it from the front, it's kind of like saloon architecture, right? The back side is telling you this is architecturally what it is, right? It's just kind of a small house, and then it has a little bedroom up here. But when you look at it from the front, it's this, flat saloon front where it looks like it's going to be this solid gable all the way to the back, but it's not. And we can see that the facade even protrudes a little further here. On the interior, he does pull a couple of these moves as well, famously with the same chimney, the fireplace. So you'll notice it is quite exaggerated in size. It's super, super big for the size of the house. It is a very small house. One of the things that postmodernists celebrate is eclecticism. So they understand that when people move into a house or design a house, you're not going to have curated furniture, right? So when we looked at Corbu's house, right, the Villa Savoie, remember he advertised it with this image of the hat and the flowers and the lifestyle he was selling, and all the furniture was designed by his group. With Frank Lloyd Wright, all of the furniture was designed by him in his studio. Postmodernists don't believe in that. They believe that that is a very artificial approach to how people live. People collect things over time. They'll buy things as they live in the house, and it's very fake, in their opinion, to have to curate your house to fit a very specific look that might change over time. So postmodernists give you the breathing room to allow the architecture to evolve over the years. And so you'll notice that in Bonaventure's house, or Robert Venturi's mom's house, there's a lot of different furniture types, right? There isn't really a cohesive style to the interior, which is the way most homes are. Now, in this fireplace, again, it's exaggerated in size, you'll notice that there is a staircase right behind it. And when we look at this image, notice how the fireplace eats up a big chunk of that staircase. So if we think about his book, Contradictions and Complexities in Architecture, there's a lot of competition going on, and yet there's a symbiosis of these pieces at the same time, because both the staircase and the fireplace are vertical elements in a home. Everything else is horizontal, but these are the vertical circulation, whether it's of air or of people. And they're both usually paired in the center of the home, and they're usually butted up against each other. And Robert Venturi celebrates that by making them look like they are physically fighting each other for space. So in the case of the fireplace, you can see that it's literally invading the space of the staircase. The staircase is trying to become wider and take up as much space as it can as it gets higher and higher. Then it's cut off, and it becomes very small as it gets into the bedroom, which is actually quite cozy if you think about the fact that you don't want this massive staircase coming into your room. If we look at it from the other end, you'll notice that the fireplace is then responding to the staircase. The staircase is kind of encroaching on it. And so the fireplace is then saying, all right, then, rather than, just being straight up and down, I'm going to shift my weight over to this other side where you can't interrupt me, right? So there is this dichotomy, this conversation that's going on between these two vertical pieces that we haven't really seen done before. And if any modernist were to see that, they would be abhorred by this, right? Where are the clean lines? Where are the perfect geometries, the expression of these cubes as individual pieces having a specific function in the home? We don't see that here. We see them meshing and fighting with each other. So there is a beauty to postmodernism, but again, it is an acquired taste. There's another image. This is in her dining room, where we can see the juxtaposition of the traditional home with flat roofs, and then Robert Venturi bringing in that pediment shape over it. So it's modernist, it's not modernist, it's a little bit historic, but it's not. So lots of things coming together, and it really goes to show less is a bore for him, because more is more. He just wants to have as much as he can in there, and why not? Eventually, Robert Venturi does go teach at Yale University, where he meets the love of his life, Denise Scott Brown. We will talk a little bit more about Denise next semester, but basically, both of them together open this studio. They teach a studio class at Yale University, and Yale has a tradition of taking its students on trips when they're in studio. So when Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown come together to form this new studio class, their destination of choice is none other than Las Vegas. And the Yale students that signed up for that studio are perplexed, right? They're going, Why are we going to Las Vegas? Everyone else is going to New York, to DC, to Europe to study all these amazing pieces of modernist architecture. And you guys are taking us to Las Vegas to see what, right? That was the question. What are we going to learn from Las Vegas? And what Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi become enamored with and what they teach their class is the power of signage, right? So they come back from this trip and they write Learning from Las Vegas, which is basically a summary of what their studio course was about and what they essentially were teaching their students to do while in Vegas. So this is just a couple of quotes again. So they say, the commercial strip, the Las Vegas strip in particular, challenges the architect to take a positive, non-chip on the shoulder view. What does that mean? It means that traditionally, as architects, even in this course, we tend to train ourselves to view all these historic monuments, the best buildings, the most iconic buildings, the cleanest buildings, right? The icons of each era. But we largely ignore everything else that happens. Sometimes it's honestly because of time, because, there just isn't enough time in a semester to teach everything. But for many other people, there's just not enough value in looking at the vernacular. And so they then go on to say architects are out of the habit of looking non-judgmentally at the environment because orthodox modern architecture is supposed to be progressive, if not revolutionary, utopian, and puristic, and it is dissatisfied with existing conditions. So what are they saying here? They're saying that architects they've been trained to not be able to go out into the everyday city and be able to see beauty in it. For modern architects with a modern training, they are taught to look at a very specific group of buildings that do not include neoclassical, they do not include historicism. They're just Corb, Mies, Van der Rohe, right? All the names that we've talked about, that is what they're studying, and that is what they're going to reproduce. And they're saying modernism generally is dissatisfied with existing conditions. So that is why they're always seeking to have a social reform agenda and impose, again, the architect's hand, Corbus's hands coming in there to tell you how to live your life, to tell you what a society should be like. But Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown are saying that as architects, we have to be able to go out into society, into any city, into any street, and just look at it and not judge it just because it doesn't look like great architecture, but to rather observe it, learn from it, respond from it, get inspiration from it. And then when we produce our architecture, it's going to be of the place. And they finish that off by saying, modern architecture has been anything but permissive, meaning that it's constraining. Architects have preferred to change the existing environment rather than enhance what is there. And we did see that a lot of the projects that were 19th century were torn down completely. They didn't see value in it because it wasn't in their image. It wasn't the philosophy that they believed in. It wasn't good enough. And we see that during the 60s, 70s with counterculture and these ideas, people are beginning to rethink that, and they're going, maybe we should pay attention to what the rest of the world looks like. And Vegas, being the city that it is, which at that point in time was usually clowned upon by most architects, there was nothing of value there for them to look at, was the perfect place to take your students, because you would force them for a whole semester to sit there and try to find something useful in all of these casinos. Granted, generally, they are not the pinnacle of architecture, but if you can at least salvage something from it, you're going to open up your mind and begin to kind of destroy that norm that modernism had created. So postmodernism is in many ways trying to revive the idea of the Bauhaus teaching, where the Bauhaus, remember, first they brought you in for a couple of years to learn theories, where you would kind of have a clean slate and not have all of that baggage of neoclassicism. And Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown are doing that for their students, where they don't want them to have that baggage of modernism has to be this. And if you don't do that, you're not a modernist and we're not going to recognize you. And they're trying to allow them to have more breathing room, to have, complexity and contradiction, if you will. And in Learning from Las Vegas, we get the famous idea of duck and the shed, which I will explain. So duck buildings are those that tell you what they are from the outside. So famously, they did see this building in Long Island, New York. It basically sells duck eggs and ducks, and it's kind of obvious, right? It's shaped like a duck. A decorated shed, on the other hand, is just a box, and then they put a facade on it. And if you notice, it's a saloon front, very much like what Robert Ventori did on his mom's house. And the sign is telling you what it is, right? So when we look back at Las Vegas, the power of the sign to tell you this casino is the Sahara, even though it looks nothing like a desert, or for it to tell you this is the frontier, even though it is just a box, or this is a plaza, right? Or in the case of the Las Vegas Boulevard Strip, right, we do have the Paris, the Bellagio. Those buildings don't really look like what's in Paris or what is in Italy, but the sign is telling us that. The applied decoration is telling us that. It is selling us an idea, and we, as tourists or as people who experience it, just kind of accept it, right? We're not there necessarily looking at it and going, this doesn't look like Paris. We are playing into the fantasy, and postmodernists want us to do that. So, Robert Ventori and Denny Scott Brown argue that ultimately the decorated shed is actually better. Why? Because if you're selling eggs, right? If you're selling whatever you're selling, you want a floor plan that's going to fit your needs. So they do believe that form follows function, but not in the way that modernists did. Where, remember, modernists, if it was an assembly, it had to be round, and you had to be able to see that from all sides. But for Robert Ventori and Denise Scott Brown, that didn't always hold true. So if you wanted, again, to sell duck eggs, it would make more sense to have a square building where you could have cabinets that fit into square corners rather than have this weird duck shape where it has these weird curves that you can't necessarily fit furniture neatly into just because you want to sell the image of the duck. So they believe that too many modernists have fallen into the duck trap where they're trying to say form follows function, and in doing so, yes, it looks like that from the outside, but is it really selling that to the user on the inside is the question. So why not just have a box where the user will be able to do everything you need to do, and then just put a sign that tells us this is this, this is that, this is what it's supposed to be. The other thing postmodernists are thinking about is the concept of time. So they're thinking, in 30 years, this building might not want to be this anymore, or the function of it, the idea of what a restaurant is, might change. So why would we constrain ourselves with this form that is very specific to this idea in this time period, when we could build a box that is something that can change over time? You would just have to change the decoration, change the sign, and it is a perfectly usable building. You don't have to bulldoze it all together because your program doesn't work anymore. So for them, this is good architecture. They're also very fascinated with the idea of the highway and the car still. So they're thinking, if you're driving and you're trying to figure out what is that building, the easiest way to do that is to look at a sign. So if we think about all our strip malls and even the Las Vegas Strip, it immediately tells us, I'm the Aria, I'm the Paris, I'm Mandalay Bay. And we know that not because we look at the building and it's screaming Paris or it's screaming Mandalay Bay at us, but because the sign is telling us that that's what it is. So we, as consumers, can easily identify it and go, I want to go there, I want to go there. So this is a furniture store, and you can see the name is absolutely enormous. If you're driving at 50 miles per hour, you're not going to miss that, right? Versus if they tried to shape this so that form follows function, and it looked like, I don't know, a couch, that's not really going to work for actually displaying couches inside of it, right? That's not to say that that's actually what modernists were doing, right? They weren't actually creating a couch, but generally, if we look back at modernist architecture, they did have very abstracted forms where you'd have to sit there for at least 5-10 minutes, really ponder what is the meaning of the building, what do they intend to do this, what is the symbolism of it. And Ventori and Brown understand that most people are not going to take that time to just stare at a building and try to understand what it means. That's what architects do. So modernism for them is largely geared towards impressing the architect, but everyday people not only don't understand it, they don't care about it. We also have signs like these, so they glorify this, right? This is for them a kind of duck decorated shed. It's a big sign that is shaped like a sandwich that's clearly telling us and visually showing us this is what we're selling. So what is postmodernism then? These are the 4 characteristics, but one thing to know about them is postmodernists do not like to be put into a box. They generally don't like to be defined. Again, one of their biggest critiques of modernism is the fact that it's a very narrow definition and it's a very narrow look for them. So when they conceive the idea of postmodernism, they really don't define it at all. For them, it's simply borrowing from lots of places. But for the purposes of this course, I am going to give you a couple of pointers of what postmodernism is generally. So one, they use ornaments from historic precedent that is deliberately distorted. So this column is a great example. We've all seen the good neoclassical column at this point, right? And we know that this is not it. It has been completely exaggerated. We know that this is trying to be an Ionic capital, but it is completely out of scale, right? It's poking fun at itself on purpose. It's a very self-aware architecture, and in many ways, again, it's inflammatory. So it's doing this on purpose to enrage both the neoclassicist who loves neoclassical architecture and the modernist who looks at this and goes, "That's disgusting." Number two, the exaggeration of architectural elements to emphasize their symbolism. So in this case, what are they emphasizing? The column. Why? It's structure, right? So it obviously wants us to go, oh, that's a structural column, which we already kind of inherently know, but they're just exaggerating it in the same way that Vintori exaggerates the fireplace. He exaggerates the staircase. This is a house with its gable, right? It's very in your face. Postmodernism tends to be a very obvious type of architecture. There's no mystery to it. As soon as you see it, you kind of get the whole story, and that's what they want it to be. They want it to be accessible architecture that anyone, regardless of them being an architect or not, can easily understand just by looking at it. Number three, the color scheme of pastels and low contrast. This is arguably one of the ugliest parts of postmodernism. They tend to use a very kind of close scheme of colors, typically mauves, very desaturated, kind of sad looking reds and blues. I don't know why. I guess it was just popular at the time, but a good example of it is in the School of Architecture in the bathrooms. They have this like really sad looking pink for the women's restroom at least, and then it has this really sad like blue. The School of Architecture in general has a very postmodernist kind of color scheme to it. If you look at the AC, the beams, there's this kind of like mauve purple, this kind of candy blue to it. That's kind of what postmodernism is, and it makes sense School of Architecture looks like that because it was constructed in the 90s, which was just a couple of years after postmodernism was at its peak. And lastly, the mixing of materials. So where modernists tried to be very pure and they were just doing glass, steel, and concrete, postmodernists used those three, and then they added a whole other bunch of, more traditional historic materials. So they used brick, they used tile, and they mismatched them in the same building. So oftentimes they did clash with each other, but that was kind of the point, right? They were trying to kind of get a response out of people, even if it wasn't a good one, even if they thought it was ugly. So this is one example of a building. This is the Institute for Scientific Information, which is inspired by a punch card. Right, so this is the way that data was recorded during this time period by computers. And so they're trying to literally show that to us, right? The building is a sign that is telling us I am a scientific, computer type of building. I deal with technology. For us, and even for myself, I have to admit, I would probably not recognize that from the get-go because I didn't even know what this was. But for someone that was a contemporary when this was being built, they would immediately be able to recognize that this has to do with technology, right? And then if we think about the use of the building, assuming that in the future this was, re repopulated to become a bank or some other type of building, you can easily take off that decoration, put something else on it, and now it's a perfectly usable building for some other type of function, right? So this is what they're arguing, that when we put the decoration very surface applied, very ornamental, we can then reuse the structure itself for something else, and that is technically a more sustainable way of constructing. In London, we have the National Gallery. This is the historic National Gallery, right? A clean, neoclassical building with its Corinthian columns. We've seen plenty of these. And eventually they get an expansion, right? So this is the building itself right here. And then this is the expansion that Robert Vintori and Denise Scott Brown are invited to do. Now, you'll notice that they are using classical language, but we're going to break down the way that they're doing it. And yes, they are trying to be quite provocative with it. So first off, you'll notice that on this end, it is quite blank, right? And you'll notice that it's almost kind of modernist, right? It is a blank white cube with a nice orthogonal corner. Then we begin to add little by little, right, little hints of classicism. At first in low density, right, a couple pop-out windows here that have their mullions. We begin to see pieces of the entablature ever so slightly in between there, but it's still very, subdued. Then we get into this portion here, and I want you to see how the columns are being used not as columns, but as a screen, right? So we're beginning to open it up and we're showing actually, this is not the facade. The facade is back there. The doors are back there. Whereas in the traditional building, they're right there, right on the surface of the masonry right here. We're using it as a screen. So they're playing with the idea of what traditional historic architecture is, and they're mixing it with the modernist approach here. Lastly, my favorite part, notice that in this part, they're doing a full, modernist glass curtain wall, right? Unobstructed. There's really nothing historical about it. And so to respond to that, they take this piece of the facade and it's almost like they're peeling back a curtain. So if all of this had been laid out with classical columns and you then peeled it back, that's why it looks so scrunched up right here, right? Because it's like a malleable piece of malleable curtain of brick facade that's being pulled back. So they're playing with the expectations of the materiality, of what neoclassical architecture typically looks like, and even of what modernism is. And then notice they get even more modernist right here, right? They're expressing the interior staircase right there. All right, here's another example. So this is a piazza that is meant to be a celebration of Italian Americans in New Orleans. If you recognize the shape, again, postmodernism tends to be very obvious. That is the map of Italy. It is supposed to be a representation of Italian heritage, and it's supposed to be a place where they can host all of their festivals, right? Italians have a lot of different festivals. So this is a place where they could celebrate Italianness, basically. And if you look at it, it kind of looks like something that almost belongs in Vegas. This is the entryway to it, so you can see they're kind of alluding to classicism, to a triumphal arch almost. This is what it looks like once you're there. So there's certain callbacks to it, right? The way that the font that's being used, it's supposed to be for the Festival of St. Joseph, which they write here, so the architecture is literally telling us, it's quite obvious, it's for St. Joseph. But they're also using the historic font that was on most of the triumphal arches, if you recall. Then over here, notice that they're mixing metals into traditional masonry, or in this case, stucco architecture. So we're getting this really interesting dichotomy in unexpected ways that is, in many ways, supposed to get a response out of you, right? The way they're doing it is, of course, incorrect classicism. There's no way that this is going to be actual correct classicism. Sorry. Here's a small detail where we can see they're almost using a high-tech approach. This is completely made out of metal, right? So they're using prefabricated pieces and they're having water come out of it. So it just, overall, it doesn't make sense. And it looks like something that belongs in Las Vegas, right? And then to add to that, they add all of these neons. So they are trying to be provocative. They are trying to be very obvious. They're trying to get a response out of people. And they're trying to make it something that is accessible to the everyday person. If someone that didn't know anything about architecture walked into here, they would immediately know that it has something to do with Italy. We're now going to talk about another architect, Michael Graves. Michael Graves was known for his sketches, usually on yellow trace. It's not that it became yellowed, it was just originally yellow. And here we can see his color scheme, red, yellow, blue, primaries in this kind of low saturated type of look. This is a concept for a bridge. It was proposed for, I believe, South Dakota, which, if you know the vernacular of South Dakota, it doesn't look like this, right? So once again, being provocative, he's doing it just for the sake of doing it, just to be fun, just to be different. He knows what the modernists are going to give them. He knows that it's going to be minimal. They're going to be saying less is more. And so Michael Graves is giving them everything, right? Even fountains on a bridge. This is one of his most famous, if not his most famous building, called the Portland Building in Portland, Oregon. This is an office building that is meant to be a celebration of what Oregon is, or what Portland is. It was selected because it was so different from all the other entries. And I think you can see that, right? So it has a lot of color, the way it's composed. You can clearly read all these different volumes rather than being this slender, crystal skyscraper, which is what was becoming normal at the time. He made this massive cube with bright colors. And if you notice classical references, Michael Graves does tend to abstract classicism to a point where you almost don't understand it. But I hope that at this point you guys can see, right, the fluting of the column. You have a Doric kind of pediment or capital up here, and then you have cut off entablature, cornice, right? It's very exaggerated in scale, and then it's not always placed where it should be or at its correct proportion, but that's the point of it. It also was supposed to have this 3D ribbon over here, which would have been quite impressive. And it was just put on there to be a kind of response to the lack of ornament in traditional modern architecture. And remember, Adolf Loos was arguing in like 1899, early 20th century. He was saying it was a crime to use ornament because you were wasting people's time and it was considered barbaric. And now, almost 100 years later, we're having Michael Graves use very obvious ribbon ornament on the side of a building just for the sake of doing it. In the front, or sorry, let's get to the plan first, kind of a square donut. It's kind of a callback to the Renaissance palazzo, but you'll notice it is lacking its courtyard. If you'll recall, the reason that a Renaissance palazzo had a courtyard was to allow cross ventilation and daylight to really permeate the space. At this point, we have technology, right? We have AC, we have elevators. You don't really need to use the outdoor elements if you don't want to. And so the Portland building's biggest kind of biggest flaw is the fact that it relies too heavily on mechanical systems, and daylight is very scarce in there, right? Look at the building, right? You just have these tiny little pop windows when you could have had technically a glass skyscraper and have all that daylight in there. He decides to make these little pops instead. And so these are the windows, these tiny little ones right here. When I first look at this plan, I think that the window are these longer portions because I'm trained to think about daylight. We're trained to think that, traditional skyscraper buildings have more window than they do solid wall. And here he's inversing that relationship. So it's a little bit difficult to understand that first. There's the front of it. And there is Portlandia. So this is a physical, kind of statue representation of the city of Portland. Notice that she is not, a kind of well-behaved statue that is standing up and looking regal with her trident. Instead, she has this very animated pose to her, right? So the whole building is trying to be a sort of counterculture representation, which is exactly how Portland prides itself. On the side, unfortunately, we did have value engineering, so that big 3D ribbon that was supposed to go there became this instead. So it's a flat kind of tile ornamentation instead. It still has the concept there, but personally, I would have loved to have seen that exaggerated ribbon. It's already, in my opinion, an ugly building, so adding that ribbon would have been pretty amazing to see. Instead, we got this kind of flat value engineered piece, but again, some people like it, some people don't. It was meant to be quite provocative. And here we can once again see vertical fluting, and then we have windows in between, right? So very, very large exaggerated scale. The interiors have that color scheme, so I think you can see a little bit more where SOA gets its inspiration from, right? The mauve colors, the blue, this type of tile work was very, very prevalent during postmodernism. Now, one place where I think it works amazing is anywhere that we have Disney buildings, because Disney is pretty much at its core postmodernism, right? It's trying to create a fantasy for you. It is exaggeration. If you think about when you go to Disneyland, there's this section, Toontown, and all the elements are exaggerated, right? They're wonky and oversized and too small at the same time. So postmodernism works really perfectly for the concept of Disney. And this one was also made by Michael Graves, and I love this building, right? And not only does it have more daylight, but the way in which he incorporates the branding into it. So if you're driving by, you know who that building belongs to, right? He has his 7 dwarves on here. This is another building, also a Disney building. This is their employment center. If you've been to the It's a Small World ride, you will probably recognize some of the inspiration for this. So notice they're using a modernist corner, right? So it's like a pop-out window. You can see the structures here and then the windows out here. It's a pop-out corner window, but then the language of it is very Gothic. So Disney and Michael Graves clearly understand the origins of the company and medieval fairy tales, and they're using that. Notice the little Disney battlements, like the tops of a castle, right? The turrets. We have these kind of pointed windows, lancet windows, like a Gothic cathedral. And then you're pairing that with this kind of ultra modernist entryway. Lots of juxtaposition going on. On the inside, this is what the hallway looks like. So we have that patterning continuing, right? The color scheme is all there. We have this little bridge, which highly resembles the Venetian. If you think about the Venetian in Las Vegas, the bridges that go over it kind of look like this, which makes sense because pretty much all of Las Vegas is quite postmodernist. In the center, we have our traditional rotunda, and they're making fun of it, right? They're having fun with it. They're putting their Disney characters on top instead of classical statues like we saw in the Romantic Classicism, the Altus Museum. If you remember that rotunda, they're making fun of it right here. They're having fun with it, and that's exactly what postmodernism should be. This is a building also by Disney in Orlando. So, Disneyland has its Disney World over in Florida. So this is the building that they have over there. Similar style going on. They also tend to use this in downtown Disney. So the district right before you enter Disneyland tends to have a lot of this language as well. So notice that the way that they're using the glass, the spandrel, they're playing with it and they're creating a kind of gingham kind of picnic pattern on their facade. And then the entrance is, again, a very clear depiction of Mickey ears, so you can't miss it. You know who this building belongs to, right? Exaggerated scale, color, the way this cube is coming out kind of sideways. In plan, the front and then the back are a mirror image of each other. So this is the front, or sorry, this is the back. This is the front. So you'll notice that they kind of look the same, so it gives you a lot of deja vu. Even the entrance as you're driving into the headquarters does have a Mickey shape. I'll show you very quickly what the front and the back of this building look like. That's the front, right? And then you'll notice the back looks exactly the same, except for the fact that it has water. So they are, again, very playful. There is that facade. It's creating this optical illusion where you don't know which of the dots is actually black, the famous optical illusion. And then in section, they have this really great detail where the inside is actually a sundial, right? So it's painted to have all the times of day, times of year, and then you can immediately tell what time it is based on where the shadow is lying. So it would look like this, which is a really ingenious detail to add inside of there. Now, we also have more serious type of architecture that is considered postmodern as well. This is a skyscraper in Pittsburgh. This one is very obviously inspired by Gothic architecture. So you can see that they're completely covering it in glass. So in this case, they are following, the crystal glass skyscraper everyone wants, but it's very tongue-in-cheek in the sense that, they're giving us the traditional skyscraper, but they're also giving us one of the most historic buildings that we know, which is the Gothic cathedral. And you can see even the way the front is shaped like this, it almost looks like this is the front of the cathedral. This is its west transept coming out, right? This is the tower of the cathedral. So there are callbacks if you know how to look for them. This is what is largely considered the first postmodern skyscraper, the AT&T building. This is located in New York City, and obviously this one is more based on classical architecture. It is very tall, but I want you to look at the masonry use, right? If you look at most New York City skyscrapers made of stone, you can't really see the joints from this distance. They do try to cover them and they are quite seamless. And in this case, they did emphasize them. They really want to show us the materiality. This is an old, ancient type of construction. And then as you're standing underneath its, the skirt of the building in the lobby, It is quite open, but then you also have these massive piers that evoke, ancient architecture, hypostyle halls like Egyptian ones. And there's the entrance, so it's a colossal colonnade. It's also kind of like stripped classicism if you look at it. So as you've seen, postmodernism isn't really a single set of design. We have Disney buildings, we have this building, we have the glass cathedral skyscraper building, and they're all considered postmodernism despite being a little bit different. This is a magazine cover I found from 1979. It was a couple years before it was actually constructed, but here we have the architect Philip Johnson carrying his little AT&T building model, and notice it's saying US architects doing their own thing. So they're now beginning to be recognized in the media as breaking away from the traditional, line of modernism. And eventually, although it begins in the United States, this also begins to be picked up in other regions of the world, like in France. So we have the Antigone district, which is all of this right here. Now, you might be looking at it and saying that looks very historical, and you'll be quite correct in saying that the forms are historical, very heavily inspired by Baroque architecture, anything from the 16th century. If we think about Versailles, Versailles has those arms coming out. It is symmetrical. It is large in scale. It has these large colonnades. That's what's happening here, right? It's very axial. But when we look at the close-up images, we can begin to see where they go postmodern. So we're going to analyze this facade right here just to give you an idea. Let's start with the overall composition. You'll notice that it's a little bit longer on the right side, so it's not quite symmetrical. If you recall, classical architecture is all about proportion and symmetry, so they're making fun of it right here. And if you recall, modern architecture is about asymmetry, but you have to do it in a way that looks balanced. And in this case, it doesn't look very balanced, right? This side is almost as long as this side, but not quite. It's just slightly longer to a point where it just bothers you to look at it. It doesn't look aesthetically pleasing like the modernists have it, where it's asymmetrical composition, but it just looks right. In this case, it just kind of looks wrong when you look at it too long. If we keep looking at it further, you'll notice that the opening right here isn't perfectly encapsulated by this arch. Instead, it kind of ends inside of the open space itself. And so we have this prism of glass right here read as a separate kind of cube. And then it looks like this is just a skin or a cage that's put on top of it. So they're, again, poking fun at the rigidity and the very almost royal nature of classicism. On the left, we have more of a solid feel to it. So notice that they do have these kind of capitals going on every so often. The dentils are incredibly exaggerated on this side. And then if we look at the other end, it's more simple. It's more of a stripped classicism. And look at the fact that this is bigger, right? So they could have very easily just incorporated it into the building itself and ended it quite nicely, but instead they chose to be provocative, go into this space, create this weird open little slot. But the magic of that is that then the glass behind it again reads as though you slid in a glass cube into a neoclassical cage. The top of it is also quite different. This is a view of the backside where you can see again the detachment of that glass facade from the neoclassical pieces. Notice right here that they're playing with the fact that it looks like it's cut in section, right? So it's this flat pilaster look. It is not 3D. They are giving us the silhouettes, but they are not giving us the full detail of it. And then up on top, we have this open colonnade. So in this case, I think it honestly would feel quite nice to be there, but it really does look very Las Vegas, right? Which is why Las Vegas is known as a postmodernist city. At least our strip is known as postmodernist, because you do have these little playful moments. All right, so that is the end of the lecture. To conclude, postmodernism is again not really a set style. They are drawing from historical precedent. What that precedent is really up to the designer. Generally, they have a closed color scheme. For the most part, They are, again, just trying to break loose from what modernism has tried to make them be. Modernism at this point is the norm. You are kind of put in a box, and if you don't follow it, you're not considered a true architect. And if you can't understand the abstracted nature of a modernist building, you're not considered, smart enough or deep enough to understand the meaning. So postmodernism seeks to break away from that, make it a very obvious architecture that's more accessible, that anyone can understand. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It is still very fresh, I would say. Postmodernism did begin in 60s, 70s, meaning that it's really only about 50 years old at the oldest. So it's not old enough to be considered historic like modernism is, but it's also not new enough to be considered contemporary, which is why, for the most part, when people think about postmodernism, they think of it as outdated architecture, which is why you get this kind of, harsh response to it. But I think that in around 30, 40, maybe 50 years, it will be considered a little bit more historic. And we're already seeing a lot of efforts to preserve certain buildings, put them on national heritage lists so that they don't get torn down. Even if, they're not the most appealing, like the Portland building, they are still quite important to the discussion of architecture. So I'm going to leave you with that today. When we come back on Monday, I'm going to be talking about some other branches that broke away in the 80s and 90s, and that will be your last lecture for the course. Make sure that you do your quiz. It is online. And I think that's about it. Make sure you do your reading as well, and I will see you guys on Monday.